My name is Emily. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the reliable one, the calm one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, the woman who handled things quietly so that other people didn't have to feel uncomfortable. On the surface, my life looks unremarkable in a way that makes people underestimate me. I work in a stable profession. I don't raise my voice. I don't make dramatic exits. I've never been the kind of person who demands attention or announces her sacrifices. If you met me at a family gathering or in a meeting, you'd probably describe me as nice, maybe reserved, maybe even forgettable. And for a long time, I believed that was a compliment. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about cutting people off in a blaze of anger or proving anyone wrong in a loud way. It's about something quieter, and I think more honest. It's about what happens when you give generously, responsibly, and with love, and still get told it's not enough. It's about what happens when help is mistaken for obligation, and kindness is reinterpreted as weakness. At its center is my relationship with my parents. I want to be clear about that upfront. They are not monsters. They are not villains. They are human, shaped by fear, pride, and expectations they never questioned. That's part of what makes this story complicated and worth telling. Because the hardest moments in life don't usually come from obvious cruelty. They come from quiet entitlement, from boundaries that were never acknowledged because they were never spoken about. The emotional journey you're about to hear moves slowly on purpose. It begins with small moments most people would dismiss. A comment here, an assumption there, nothing explosive, nothing you could easily point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. Instead, it's the accumulation, the way certain roles get assigned without discussion, and how silence can slowly turn into a cage. There was a point in my life where I made a decision that, on paper, looked generous and responsible. I paid off my parents' debts, not as a grand gesture, not as a bargaining chip, but because I believed that if I removed the burden, we could all finally breathe. What followed surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. What they wanted wasn't help, it was control. This story is about realizing that too late and then deciding what to do with that knowledge. There are no sudden windfalls here, no shouting matches, no public confrontations, just observation, patience, and a recalibration of self respect. I'm telling it now, not to vilify anyone, but to document the moment I stopped confusing responsibility with submission. If you've ever been the one people leaned on without asking how much weight you could carry, if you've ever been praised for being strong when what they really meant was convenient, you might recognize yourself somewhere in this. Before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever helped someone wholeheartedly only to realize later that your generosity quietly rewrote the rules of how they treated you? To my parents, I was never the difficult one. I was the one who didn't need checking on, the one who figured things out on her own. When bills were tight, I understood. When plans changed, I adjusted. When stress filled the room, I learned how to take up less space so there would be more oxygen for everyone else. Growing up, I didn't consciously decide to become that person. It happened the way these things usually do, quietly, gradually. through small moments that taught me which versions of myself were welcomed and which ones caused discomfort. I learned early that competence earned approval faster than vulnerability, that solving problems was safer than naming feelings. So I leaned into what worked. By the time I was in my 20s, my role was fully formed. I was the responsible daughter, the one relative praised in conversations I wasn't part of. Emily's got a good head on her shoulders. Emily will be fine. Emily doesn't need help. Those sentences followed me everywhere, said with pride, never with curiosity. At family gatherings, I was often the one helping in the background, cleaning up, organizing, smoothing over awkward moments. Not because I was asked, but because it was assumed. And I complied because it felt easier than explaining why I shouldn't have to. There was a strange satisfaction in being useful. It gave me a sense of worth that felt earned, not demanded. My parents relied on that version of me, not in an overt way. They didn't sit me down and declare expectations. It was more subtle than that. They'd mention a problem in passing and pause, just long enough. They'd sigh over finances without directly asking for advice. They'd say things like, "You're so good with numbers," or "You understand these things better than we do," as if they were observations, not invitations. And I stepped into the gaps, again and again. From the outside, it probably looked like a healthy dynamic. An adult daughter helping aging parents, mutual respect, cooperation. I told myself that too. I framed it as gratitude for everything they'd done for me, for the opportunities I'd had, for the sacrifices they'd made when I was younger. Helping them felt like closing a circle. But underneath that narrative was something else, something harder to articulate at the time. My value in the family wasn't tied to who I was. It was tied to what I could absorb: stress, responsibility, unspoken expectations. I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable, noticed mostly when it's missing. No one asked how much I was carrying. No one wondered whether I had limits. And to be fair, I never announced them. I wore my self sufficiency like armor. It protected me from being seen as needy, but it also made me invisible in ways that mattered. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being the strong one. You're praised for not needing support, then quietly punished when you eventually do. At the time, I didn't recognize it as loneliness. I thought it was maturity. I thought it was love expressed through action. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. I was the solution, not the participant, the stabilizer, not the one allowed to wobble. And because I played that role well, no one questioned whether it was fair or whether I had chosen it at all. This part of the story isn't about blame, it's about context, about understanding how easy it is to slide into an identity that's rewarded by everyone else, even when it costs you something internally. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. There were no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, just a quiet understanding. Emily will handle it. And for a long time, I did. The first time I felt something was off, it didn't register as hurt. It registered as confusion. It was a small moment, so small that if I told it out of context, most people would shrug and move on. We were sitting at my parents' kitchen table. Nothing dramatic, just coffee cooling in mugs, The familiar hum of the refrigerator, daylight settling into late afternoon. My father was talking about a credit card balance he'd been struggling to reduce. Not complaining, just stating facts the way he always did. I listened. I asked a few questions. I offered a suggestion, one practical adjustment that could shave off interest over time. He nodded, distracted. Then my mother laughed lightly and said, "Well, you don't really understand how hard it is when you have real responsibilities." She didn't say it sharply. There was no edge in her voice. It was casual, almost affectionate. The kind of sentence people say without realizing it lands somewhere. The room moved on immediately. My father continued talking. The kettle clicked off. No one noticed that I had gone still. Real responsibilities. At that point in my life, I was working full time, paying my own rent, and managing my own finances without help. I hadn't asked for recognition. I didn't need applause. But the dismissal, so offhand, so unnecessary, caught me off guard. It contradicted the role I had been playing so carefully. I was trusted with advice, but not acknowledged as someone whose life carried weight. I remember smiling and nodding, letting the moment pass. That was my instinct. Don't make things awkward. Don't turn a comment into a confrontation. I told myself she hadn't meant it. I told myself she was tired. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. But the feeling lingered. That was the cut. Not the comment itself, but the way it rewrote the moment after I'd already stepped into my role. I was useful when my input helped. I was invisible when it came to legitimacy. My value was conditional, and I hadn't realized the conditions could shift so easily. In the weeks that followed, similar moments appeared. Still subtle, still easy to dismiss individually. Advice I gave that was later repeated by someone else and suddenly confirmed as smart. Decisions I made in my own life that were second guessed with a tone of amused skepticism. "You're sure about that?" Delivered with a smile that suggested confidence was premature when it came from me. What made it harder was that no one else seemed to notice. Extended family members praised me constantly. Friends commented on how lucky my parents were to have me. On the surface, everything aligned with the story I told myself. That I was respected, appreciated, valued. So when discomfort surfaced, I treated it like a personal flaw. I assumed the problem was my perception, not the pattern. I reminded myself that families are imperfect, that intentions matter more than phrasing. I adjusted internally rather than externally, the way I always had. There's a specific kind of self doubt that comes from moments like that. Not explosive enough to demand action, but sharp enough to lodge under the skin. You replay the sentence later, alone, wondering why it stayed with you, wondering whether you imagined the sting. I didn't talk about it, not to friends, not to anyone. Partly because it felt too minor to explain, and partly because I didn't yet have language for what was happening. I just knew that something had shifted slightly. A hairline fracture in the way I saw my place in the family. The cut didn't bleed. That's why it was dangerous. It taught me something without announcing itself. It taught me that contribution did not equal authority. That proximity did not guarantee respect. That being helpful did not protect me from being diminished in quiet ways. And still, I stayed. I stayed because the cost of leaving, or even pulling back, felt disproportionate to the offense. I stayed because I believed consistency would correct misunderstandings. I stayed because walking away from something unclear feels harder than enduring something uncomfortable. Most of all, I stayed because I didn't yet understand that the first small cut is rarely meant to hurt you. It's meant to test whether you'll notice and whether you'll tolerate it if you do. After that first moment, nothing visibly changed. That was the part that kept me quiet. There was no escalation, no apology, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Life continued in its familiar rhythm, and because everything looked the same, I convinced myself it was the same. But normalization doesn't happen all at once. It settles in gradually, like background noise you stop noticing because it's always there. Comments like the one my mother made didn't disappear. They multiplied, softly, politely, almost invisibly. Little reminders that my competence was welcome, but my authority was conditional. That my adulthood was theoretical, not quite solid enough to be taken seriously. When I explained a financial decision I'd made, my parents would exchange glances before responding. Not skeptical exactly, more amused, as if I were describing an ambitious plan rather than a calculated choice. You've always been very confident, my father would say, in a tone that suggested confidence was a phase I might outgrow. If I disagreed with them, even gently, the room would cool. Not into hostility, just into a quiet resistance that made it clear disagreement was inconvenient. The conversation would shift. My point would go unaddressed. No one would say I was wrong. They simply acted as though I hadn't spoken. That, more than anything, trained me to soften my voice, to add disclaimers before opinions. I could be wrong, but this might not matter. It's just a thought. Each qualifier made me easier to accept and easier to ignore. I told myself this was a compromise, that this was what maintaining peace looked like in adult families. I rationalized their behavior in ways that felt generous. They were from a different generation. They were under stress. They weren't used to seeing me as an equal yet did a lot of work in those explanations. The truth is, I was participating in my own diminishment. Not consciously, not dramatically, but consistently. Every time I swallowed a reaction to keep things smooth, I reinforced the version of myself that caused the least friction. And friction, I believed, was the real danger. There's a seductive logic to staying quiet. Silence feels mature, controlled, above the messiness of confrontation. I wore my restraint like proof of emotional intelligence. If I could remain calm, reasonable, unbothered, then nothing was truly wrong, right? But the body keeps score long before the mind catches up. I noticed it in the way I felt tense before visiting them, in how I rehearsed neutral responses in the car, preemptively sanding down my own edges, in how relief washed over me when visits ended, even when nothing bad had happened. That contradiction confused me more than any single comment. Other people didn't see this version of my parents. They saw warmth, humor, and generosity. And they weren't wrong. My parents could be loving. They could be proud. They could be supportive in ways that looked healthy from the outside. That made it harder to trust my internal alarms. When something is wrong but not cruel, you start negotiating with yourself. So I normalized it. I told myself that respect didn't need to be explicit, that love showed itself through action, not words, that families functioned on unspoken roles, and this was simply mine. I was the capable one, the buffer, the one who didn't need reassurance. What I didn't recognize then was how normalization erodes your sense of choice. When something becomes routine, it stops feeling optional. You stop asking whether it's acceptable and start asking how to endure it more gracefully. I learned to anticipate dismissals before they happened, to adjust expectations downward so disappointment wouldn't surprise me. That internal adjustment felt like resilience, but it was actually resignation, wearing a polite mask. No one told me outright that my needs mattered less. That's what made it effective. The message was implied, repeated, and never challenged. And because I didn't challenge it either, it settled into the background of our relationship, unquestioned. This phase of the story doesn't have a clear turning point, no decisive moment, just a slow acclimation to being slightly less visible than I deserve to be. And once that becomes normal, it's dangerously easy to accept far more than you ever would have agreed to consciously. I didn't know it yet, but by the time I recognized the role I'd been playing, I had already been rehearsing it for years. The realization didn't arrive as a revelation. There was no single sentence or dramatic incident that made everything click. It came the way uncomfortable truths often do, through repetition, through patterns becoming too consistent to ignore. I began to see my place in the family not as something I inhabited, but something I served. Whenever a problem arose, my presence was assumed before my consent was considered. If my parents needed help navigating paperwork, they called me, not to ask if I had time, but to inform me of when it would be convenient for them. If a decision required research or follow through, it landed in my lap as if by gravity. You're good at this, they'd say. It's easier for you. Easier. Not fair. Not mutual. Easier. I started paying attention to what happened when I didn't immediately step in. The pauses grew longer. The tone shifted. There was a subtle disappointment that hovered in the air, never voiced directly, but clearly felt. Silence, in those moments, wasn't neutral. It was a reminder, a prompt, a nudge back into position. The role was clear now. I was reliable, useful, and unobtrusive. I didn't complicate things with emotional needs. I didn't challenge decisions unless invited. I didn't take up space unless there was a problem to solve. In return, I received approval, pride, and a kind of affection that depended on continuity. What struck me most was how little of this had been discussed. No one had assigned me this role out loud. There were no negotiations, no acknowledgments of cost. It was simply understood. And because I had filled it so consistently, it felt almost ungrateful to question it. That's the trap of being the good one. The moment you hesitate, it feels like betrayal. I noticed how differently my boundaries were treated compared to others. When another family member said no, it was accepted without analysis. When I hesitated, it became a topic of conversation. Is everything okay? You seem stressed. The concern wasn't about my well being, it was about my availability. I wasn't seen as someone with limits. I was seen as a resource that needed maintenance. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction carried a subtext I had previously ignored. Praise functioned as reinforcement. Disappointment functioned as a correction. Neither required explicit instruction because I had already learned the rules. And I followed them, not because I was weak, but because the role rewarded predictability. It kept relationships smooth. It allowed everyone else to remain comfortable. And for a long time, I mistook that comfort for harmony. But harmony that relies on one person shrinking is not balanced. It's convenience disguised as peace. There was grief in that realization. Not dramatic grief, but a quiet mourning for the version of myself that believed being indispensable was the same as being valued. I had built an identity around dependability, and questioning it felt like pulling at a structural beam. What would be left if I stopped being the one who handled things? I didn't voice this shift. I didn't announce new boundaries. I simply observed. I watched how expectations operated independently of appreciation. I listened to what was assumed rather than what was said. And slowly, something inside me began to detach, not from my parents, but from the role itself. I could still perform it, but I no longer confused it with who I was. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. Because once you separate your identity from your utility, you regain something essential: choice. I wasn't ready to act on that yet. But the awareness had taken root, and from that point on, every decision I made would be informed by a new question, one I had never allowed myself to ask before. What if this role is optional? The shift didn't happen during an argument. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no ultimatums delivered in the heat of emotion. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the kind of moment that usually passes without being marked at all. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, sorting through my own paperwork: bank statements, tax documents, the quiet evidence of a life built carefully and deliberately. Outside, rain tapped against the window in a steady, unremarkable rhythm. I remember that detail because everything about that day was unremarkable, and yet it became a dividing line in my memory. My phone buzzed, a message from my mother. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't preface it with concern or context. She simply wrote, "We're really stressed about the debt. You understand this stuff. We need to talk." Can we talk? Not when you have time. We need. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was busy, but because something inside me had finally slowed down enough to notice the pattern without immediately reacting to it. I realized I already knew how the conversation would go. I could predict the tone, the pauses, the subtle way responsibility would slide toward me without being named. I knew how I would respond to: calm, practical, accommodating. That script had been rehearsed many times, and for the first time, I felt tired of my own predictability. What shifted wasn't my affection for my parents. It wasn't even frustration. It was clarity, a quiet, almost clinical understanding that this dynamic wasn't temporary and it wasn't accidental. It functioned exactly as designed, efficient for them, costly for me. I didn't reply right away. That pause was new, not dramatic, just deliberate. As I sat there, I thought about all the times I had stepped in without being asked, all the moments I had smoothed over without acknowledgement. I thought about how rarely anyone had asked what helping cost me, because I had trained them not to. The rain kept falling, the room stayed quiet, and in that stillness, I asked myself a question that felt almost transgressive. What would happen if I didn't immediately fix this? The answer was uncomfortable. They would feel anxious. They would feel unsupported. They might feel disappointed in me. And beneath all of that, they would feel something else: uncertainty. Because the system they relied on assumed my participation. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me honest. I finally replied. I said I could talk later in the week. No explanation, no apology, just a statement. When we did speak, the conversation unfolded exactly as expected. They explained the numbers. They emphasized the pressure. They spoke as though my involvement was a given. And for the first time, I listened differently. Not as a solver, but as an observer. I noticed how quickly responsibility was implied, how my suggestions were accepted without question, yet framed as confirmations of what they already believed, how the emotional weight of the problem was shared freely, while the emotional cost of solving it was never addressed. And something else became clear. They weren't asking for guidance. They were asking for relief, relief that required me to absorb the burden so they wouldn't have to. That was the moment the story changed. Not because I said no, not because I confronted them, but because I understood the transaction clearly for the first time. Helping them wouldn't reset the relationship, it would solidify it. The shift was internal and it was irreversible. Once you see a pattern for what it is, you can't unsee it. You can still choose to participate, but you do so knowingly. When the call ended, I didn't feel resolved. I felt alert, as if I had woken up in a familiar room and noticed, for the first time, which doors were locked. That day didn't mark the end of anything. It marked the end of my confusion. And from that point on, silence was no longer just a habit. It became a choice. After that day, nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. I still answered calls. I still listened. I still spoke in the same calm, measured tone. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have assumed everything was exactly as it had always been. But internally, the silence had shifted its meaning. Before, my quietness came from habit, an instinct to avoid friction, to keep things smooth. Now, it was intentional. I was no longer withholding my thoughts because I was afraid to voice them. I was withholding them because I was gathering information. I stopped volunteering solutions immediately. I let conversations breathe. When my parents described problems, I listened without jumping ahead. I noticed how quickly discomfort filled the space when I didn't rush to resolve it, how explanations stretched longer, how anxiety surfaced more clearly when I wasn't absorbing it for them. They mistook this change for a distraction. "You've been busy," my mother said once, not as a question. I nodded. It was easier than correcting her. Being busy was an acceptable reason. Awareness was not. I began to pay closer attention to how often I was included, only when something needed fixing. How rarely I was consulted when decisions were already made. Silence gave me a vantage point I'd never had before. Without my usual participation, the mechanics of the relationship became visible. What surprised me most was how quickly my restraint was interpreted as weakness. When I didn't immediately offer to help, the requests became more direct, but not more respectful. There was an edge of impatience now, a subtle pressure beneath polite phrasing, as if my role had been delayed, not questioned. that told me everything I needed to know. If my silence had been read as strength or independence, it might have prompted curiosity. Instead, it triggered urgency. They weren't concerned about my distance, they were concerned about the delay in relief. I didn't confront them with this realization. I didn't correct their assumptions. Silence, when used deliberately, has a way of inviting truth to surface on its own. During this period, I began documenting things. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, conversations, numbers, commitments that were implied but never discussed. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. For the first time, I considered outcomes beyond immediate harmony. I thought about what would happen if I continued as I had, about how expectations tend to expand, not contract, once they're met consistently, about how generosity without boundaries often becomes an obligation. My parents began to express frustration in small ways, nothing overt. Comments about how hard everything was getting, how no one really understands how much pressure we're under. The implication was familiar. You understand. You always have. And still, I stayed quiet. This was the most difficult part. Not acting, not speaking, just observing without intervening. It required more discipline than any confrontation would have, because stepping in would have restored comfort quickly. Staying silent meant sitting with discomfort, mine and theirs. I learned something important during that time. Silence doesn't just protect you, it reveals others. When you stop filling every gap, people show you how they relate to absence, whether they grow, adjust, or demand. My parents didn't adjust, they waited. That waiting confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My role wasn't appreciated for its generosity. It was relied on for its predictability. By choosing silence, I reclaimed something subtle but powerful: tempo. I was no longer reacting on their timeline. I was observing on my own. This wasn't a strategy in the dramatic sense. There were no secret plans or calculated moves, just a quiet decision to stop being the first responder to someone else's distress. And in that quiet, I began to see what they never noticed about me. I had options. While my parents waited, assuming I would eventually step back into place, I was doing something they had never associated with me. I was preparing, not in a dramatic, confrontational way. There were no secret meetings, no declarations of independence, just quiet, methodical work carried out in the margins of my life. The kind of work that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need approval. They had always seen me as capable in a narrow sense: good with numbers, organized, reliable. What they never noticed was how that competence extended beyond solving immediate problems. They never saw how I thought in systems, how I documented patterns, how I planned for consequences instead of reactions. I began by looking at my own finances through a different lens: not just stability, but leverage, liquidity, time. I mapped out what I could afford to do, and more importantly, what I could afford not to do. Generosity feels different when it's voluntary rather than expected, and I wanted that distinction to be unmistakable to myself. I reviewed past conversations, not emotionally but structurally. Who initiated them? Who defined the urgency? Who bore the emotional cost when things felt uncertain? The pattern was consistent. I had been functioning as both advisor and pressure valve, absorbing anxiety so others wouldn't have to sit with it. I stopped assuming benign intent and started observing impact instead. That shift alone clarified years of confusion. At work, I was accustomed to documenting decisions precisely because clarity protects everyone involved. I applied that same discipline privately. I wrote things down in my notebook, dates when financial stress was mentioned, amounts implied, expectations left unspoken, not as evidence, but as grounding. Memory becomes unreliable when it's filtered through obligation. This process wasn't fueled by resentment, it was fueled by self respect. I wanted to understand the full scope of what was being asked of me, even when it wasn't phrased as a request. What struck me most was how invisible all of this was to my parents. They mistook my calm for compliance, my patience for availability. They had no reason to imagine I was thinking beyond the next conversation, because I never had before. In their minds, I existed in a static role, helpful, predictable, present when needed. Growth for them meant increased capacity, not increased autonomy. I also began educating myself further, not because I lacked knowledge, but because I wanted precision. I revisited legal frameworks around family financial assistance. I studied the long term implications of informal support versus structured resolution. I learned what boundaries looked like, not emotionally, but operationally. This wasn't about control, it was about removing ambiguity. Ambiguity is where expectations hide. During this time, my parents continued to speak as though nothing fundamental had changed. They talked about the future with an assumed continuity that no longer existed. Phrases like, when this is behind us, and once things settle, floated into conversations, untethered to any plan except my eventual involvement. I listened. I noted. I didn't correct, because correction would have alerted them to a shift they weren't ready to see. What they never noticed was how much of my power had always come from restraint, from the fact that I didn't act impulsively, that I observed first, that I understood systems before engaging them. They had mistaken my quietness for passivity. But quietness had always been how I gathered information. By the end of this period, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed in the way I once might have been. I was clear, clear about what I could give without losing myself, clear about what would be taken if I didn't define limits, clear about the difference between help and control. And clarity changes the nature of choice. I hadn't made a decision yet, but I had prepared for one. And preparation, unlike reaction, doesn't require anyone else's awareness to be effective. They were waiting for me to step in. I was deciding how. The reveal didn't come with a rush of emotion. There was no surge of triumph, no anger crystallizing into resolve. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, the way truth sometimes does when you finally stop negotiating with it. I was reviewing numbers late one evening, my notebook open beside my laptop. Not my parents' numbers, mine. Cash flow, savings, long term projections. The full picture laid out without sentiment. I wasn't asking myself whether I should help. I was asking a different question entirely. What happens after I do? That's when it became unmistakably clear I could pay off their debts. All of it. Cleanly, responsibly, without destabilizing my own future. The option existed. I had built my life carefully enough that this was within reach. But what followed that realization wasn't relief. It was a second, heavier awareness. Paying off the debt wouldn't resolve the dynamic, it would complete it. I sat with that thought longer than I expected. Because on the surface, erasing the problem seemed like the most loving thing to do. No more stress for them, no more tension in conversations, no more waiting. It would look generous, responsible, even noble. But beneath that surface was the structure I had spent months observing. The expectations, the unspoken hierarchy. The way my value had been measured was by what I could absorb. If I paid everything off quietly, without redefining the relationship, I wouldn't be setting anyone free. I would be confirming something much more dangerous, that the system worked, that pressure produced results, that my silence meant consent. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power, but that using it without boundaries would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I realized then that the debt itself had never been the real issue. It was leverage, not in a calculated, malicious sense, but in a structural one. As long as the problem existed, my role remained activated. As long as my role remained activated, my autonomy stayed secondary. Removing the debt would remove the excuse, but not the expectation. I thought about what would happen next, about future emergencies, about how gratitude, if it appeared at all, would likely be brief and followed by new assumptions, about how difficult it is to reintroduce boundaries after you've proven you'll override them. This wasn't cynicism, it was pattern recognition. I didn't celebrate this clarity. I closed my notebook and sat in the quiet of my apartment, letting the reality settle. Power that you don't understand can feel intoxicating. Power you understand fully feels sobering, because now there was no ambiguity, no confusion to hide behind. I couldn't tell myself I didn't know how this would play out. I also couldn't pretend that doing nothing was neutral. If I walked away completely, the debt would remain, the stress would continue, and I would live with the knowledge that I had chosen self protection over intervention. That was a valid option, but it wasn't the one that aligned with my values. My moral code had never been about withholding help. It was about giving without humiliation, acting without cruelty, and seeing clearly before deciding. That meant the decision wasn't whether to help, it was how. For the first time, I understood that help could be final, that it could close a chapter instead of extending it. That assistance didn't have to be an invitation for continued access. That realization didn't make the choice easier. It made it precise. I knew then that whatever I did next had to be irreversible, not emotionally, but structurally. Something that wouldn't require ongoing negotiation. Something that wouldn't leave room for reinterpretation. I also knew I wouldn't announce this understanding. I wouldn't explain it in advance or seek validation for it. The reveal was private because it needed to be. Once spoken aloud, it would become something others could argue with. Some decisions are weakened by discussion. This one needed to be quiet. I returned to my notes and began outlining scenarios. Not contingencies, but outcomes. What each path would signal, what it would reinforce, what would end. By the time I closed the notebook again, I wasn't relieved. I was resolved. Once the reveal settled, I reached a point that felt unfamiliar but unmistakable. I had to choose without pretending there was a perfect answer. For most of my life, Decisions had been guided by avoidance. Avoid conflict, avoid disappointment, avoid being misunderstood. This time, avoidance wasn't an option. Every possible path forward carried a cost. The only real choice was which cost I was willing to live with. I laid the options out plainly, the way I would for a client or a project at work. The first option was to continue as I had been, to remain available, responsive, quietly responsible, to help in pieces. Advice here, support there. That path required the least disruption and promised the most immediate peace. It also guaranteed one thing: nothing would ever actually change. The role would remain intact, reinforced by repetition. The second option was to withdraw completely, to say no, step back, and allow the consequences to unfold without my involvement. That would protect my autonomy cleanly, but it would also harden something in me that I wasn't ready to harden. Distance, when used as the only boundary, can become its own form of erasure. The third option was the one I hadn't considered before this moment. Not because it was extreme, but because it required precision. I could resolve the debt entirely, once, fully, without conditions spoken aloud, but with boundaries built into the structure itself, not as an act of rescue, but as an act of closure. This option carried the highest risk emotionally, because it would look from the outside like generosity. It would invite interpretation, gratitude, entitlement, disbelief, all of it possible, none of it controllable. But it was also the only option that could end the pattern instead of extending it. I thought carefully about what I was actually afraid of. I wasn't afraid of losing money. I had accounted for that. I wasn't afraid of my parents' reaction. Reactions pass. What I feared was being rewritten, having my action reframed in a way that stripped it of intention. If I did this, I needed to accept that I couldn't manage their understanding of it. I could only manage its finality. I spent several days not acting, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be sure my calm wasn't avoidance in disguise. I waited to see if urgency or guilt would rise up and force my hand. It didn't. What surfaced instead was something steadier: alignment. The sense that one option matched who I was becoming, not who I had been performing as. I realized that paying off the debt wasn't the irreversible part. How I did it would be. I wouldn't frame it as a sacrifice. I wouldn't ask for acknowledgement. I wouldn't invite discussion about what came next. I would make the action complete, contained, and unrepeatable. No installment plans, no ongoing oversight, no future expectations implied. This would not be the beginning of a new arrangement. It would be the end of an old one. That understanding clarified everything. The decision, once made, felt quiet, not heavy, not triumphant, just settled. I didn't inform my parents in advance, not because I wanted to surprise them, but because advance notice would have turned the decision into a negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating anymore. Some choices lose their integrity when too many voices enter the room. When I finally moved forward, it wasn't with a sense of drama. It was with the same composure I brought to every other serious decision in my life: calm, documented, intentional. I knew that once this step was taken, there would be no returning to ambiguity. The relationship would either recalibrate or reveal itself fully. And for the first time, I was prepared for either outcome. I didn't announce what I was doing. There was no preface, no emotional framing, no careful build up meant to soften the impact. I moved the way I always had when something mattered, quietly, methodically, without witnesses. That was intentional. I handled the process the same way I handled serious matters at work. I verified every figure twice. I confirmed balances directly, not through second hand explanations. I reviewed timelines, penalties, and closures. I made sure there would be no loose ends, nothing that could reopen the door later under the guise of just one more thing. The silence during this period was different from before. It wasn't observational anymore, it was protective. My parents continued to speak about the debt in abstract ways, stressful, overwhelming, temporary, they hoped. They still assumed I was thinking about it, that something would eventually work out. I let those conversations pass without correction, not out of avoidance, but because correction would have shifted the focus away from the action itself. I didn't want gratitude in advance. I didn't want reassurance afterward. I didn't want this moment diluted by emotional management. This was about resolution, not performance. There's a particular stillness that comes when you act from certainty. No urgency, no second guessing, just steady movement forward. I felt it as I completed the final steps, the administrative confirmations, the quiet acknowledgements that something significant had been set in motion. No one noticed. That, more than anything, underscored how invisible my inner life had always been to them. They were accustomed to outcomes, not processes, relief, not cost. The idea that something irreversible could be happening without their awareness didn't register. Because my agency had never been part of the equation. I chose not to tell them immediately once everything was finalized. Not as a test, not as punishment. I wanted to observe what happened in the absence of urgency, to see whether the pattern would persist even when the problem no longer existed. It did. Conversations continued as before, still weighted with stress that no longer had a practical foundation. The debt had been resolved, but the role hadn't caught up yet. That lag told me something important. The pressure had become habitual. It didn't require an actual crisis anymore. When I finally told them, I did it plainly. No dramatic reveal, no build-up, just a statement of fact, delivered calmly, as though I were updating them on a completed task. It's taken care of, I said. The debt is cleared. There was a pause, long enough to feel the room shift. At first, there was disbelief, then relief, visible, immediate, unfiltered. The kind of relief that rushes in when a burden disappears without effort. They asked questions, but not about how I felt, not about what it cost. Just logistical confirmations, as if making sure the ground beneath them was solid again. I answered briefly, precisely. What I didn't do was reassure them about the future. I didn't say we'll be okay now or we'll figure things out together. I didn't frame this as a beginning because it wasn't. From their perspective, this looked like help. From mine, it was closure. I watched carefully in the days that followed, not for gratitude, but for adjustment. To see whether the relationship would recalibrate in the absence of leverage. What happened next told me everything. The first consequence wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion. It was emptiness. Once the debt was gone, there was a strange quiet that settled into our interactions. The constant low-level urgency that had shaped our conversations simply vanished. No more stressed updates. No more heavy sighs wrapped in implication. The problem that had justified my role for so long was suddenly absent, and in its place, there was nothing ready to take over. At first, my parents seemed lighter, relieved. They slept better, laughed more easily. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had been wrong, if removing the burden really would reset everything, if the relationship would naturally soften now that the pressure was gone. But relief is not the same as recalibration. Within weeks, something else began to surface, a subtle restlessness, conversations that drifted back toward finances even when there was nothing to discuss, questions framed as curiosity that felt more like fishing. So, how are you managing things these days? Delivered with an unfamiliar attentiveness. What they were feeling, though they didn't yet have words for it, was loss. Not financial loss, structural loss. The system they had relied on, the quiet certainty that I would absorb what they couldn't, was no longer operational. And because the change hadn't been negotiated or discussed, they couldn't quite locate what was missing. They just knew something felt off. I noticed it in the way requests returned, shorter this time, almost experimental. A suggestion that I look over a document just to be safe. A comment about a future expense that might need attention later. Each one floated gently, as if testing whether the old reflex was still there. I didn't react the way I used to. I responded politely, briefly. Sometimes I said, I'd look when I had time. Sometimes I didn't. There was no announcement of boundaries, just the absence of automatic compliance. That absence landed harder than any refusal would have. My parents began to feel disoriented. Without a clear problem to rally around, they had to sit with their own uncertainty. And sitting with it made them uncomfortable. So they looked for a reason. I could sense the narrative forming before it was spoken. I had changed. I had become distant. I was less involved. None of this was said with accusation yet, but the groundwork was being laid. This is the part no one warns you about. When you stop playing a role that benefits others, the discomfort they feel often gets attributed to your behavior, not the role itself. The absence becomes the offense. I remained calm through it, not detached, not cold, just steady. I didn't explain myself because explanations invite debate. And I wasn't interested in debating my right to exist outside of obligation. The more consistent I was, the more their unease sharpened. They began to reminisce openly about how close we used to be, about how I used to be more involved. The implication was clear. Closeness had been defined by my usefulness, not by mutual presence. That realization hurt, not sharply, but deeply. I saw then that the consequence of my action wasn't conflict, it was exposure. The relationship, stripped of its pressure point, revealed how much of our connection had been built around my solving problems. And they felt that loss acutely, even if they couldn't name it. I didn't rush to fill the gap. Gaps, I had learned, are informative. They show you what was holding things together. As the weeks passed, the tension shifted from practical to emotional. Subtle comments, small expressions of disappointment, not dramatic enough to confront, but persistent enough to register. They were beginning to grieve something they had never acknowledged, relying on. And I was beginning to understand that consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like confusion settling in, slowly, unmistakably, when the old rules no longer apply. By the time my parents realized something had truly changed, they were already behind it. At first, they treated the shift like a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected with tone, with reassurance, with a return to familiarity. My mother began calling more often, not with problems, but with updates that felt strangely curated. Small details, neighbors, television shows, the kind of conversations meant to re establish closeness without addressing what had disrupted it. My father took a different approach. He grew reflective. He talked about the past, about sacrifices, about how hard things had been when I was young, about how family always pulls together. These weren't accusations, they were reminders, carefully placed emotional anchors meant to pull me back into alignment. I listened, I didn't interrupt, and I didn't move. That's when the panic started to surface, not loudly, but unmistakably. They began offering adjustments, small ones at first. We don't expect you to handle things the way you used to. You've done so much already. Each sentence sounded like flexibility, but none of them addressed the core issue. They were trying to modify the tone of the dynamic without changing its structure. It was too late for that, because the shift hadn't been behavioral, it had been perceptual. I no longer saw myself as the stabilizer of the emotional or financial world. And once that perception changes, you can't be persuaded back into the role by kindness alone. The turning point came during a conversation that was meant to feel conciliatory. My mother said gently, "We just don't want things to feel distant. You don't have to do everything on your own." The irony landed with precision. I realized then that they weren't responding to my boundaries. They were responding to their loss of access. And those are very different things. If they had asked what I needed, we might have found common ground. If they had acknowledged the imbalance, we might have rebuilt something healthier. But instead, they were trying to restore proximity without relinquishing control. They wanted the outcome without the recalibration. That's when I understood. Nothing could be fixed without acknowledging what had been broken. And acknowledging that would require them to see me not as an extension of themselves, but as an autonomous adult whose generosity had limits. They weren't ready for that. Their confusion hardened into frustration, not explosive, but brittle. The warmth thinned. Conversations felt careful now, edged with unspoken resentment. They didn't say I was ungrateful, not directly. They didn't have to. It hovered in the way gratitude was mentioned, in the way silence followed my neutrality. I didn't defend myself. Defense would have kept me entangled in a narrative that no longer applied. I wasn't trying to convince them of anything. I was living a reality they hadn't consented to, and that lack of consent disturbed them more than any argument would have. There's a moment in some relationships when repair is still possible, but only if both sides are willing to change. I could see that moment passing, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door closing without being slammed. They wanted reassurance. I wanted recognition. Those wants were never met, and so the attempt to fix it became another form of pressure, subtle, persistent, ineffective. The more they tried to pull me back, the more apparent it became that what they missed wasn't closeness. It was control. By the time they sensed that clearly, the dynamic had already reset itself. Not through confrontation, through consistency. I was no longer reacting. I was no longer explaining. I was no longer filling in what they left unsaid. And without those behaviors, there was nothing left for them to repair because the old structure no longer existed. Some endings don't come with final words. They come with the realization that the conversation everyone wants to have can no longer change the outcome. That realization had finally reached them. The confrontation, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone would expect. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a conversation that could no longer avoid its own center. We were sitting in their living room, the same room where so many earlier conversations had taken place, some heavy, some mundane. The familiarity of the setting made what followed feel almost ordinary, which somehow made it more honest. My father spoke first. He said they felt I had pulled away. Those things had changed after I helped them so much. The phrasing was careful, gratitude laced with accusation. Help is framed as a point of reference rather than a closing chapter. My mother added that they didn't understand why I seemed distant now, that they had expected things to feel closer after everything was resolved. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, there was a pause, not awkward, just unfilled. Then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old moments or defend my intentions. I said one thing, calmly and clearly. I helped because I could, not because it defined my role in your lives. The room went still. They looked at me as if I had shifted slightly out of focus. Not hostile, just surprised, as though I had stepped out of a frame they hadn't realized was there. I continued evenly. I said that paying off the debt wasn't a reset button. It wasn't meant to restore an old dynamic. It was meant to close a chapter that had been quietly consuming too much space for all of us. They tried to respond, to explain how hard things had been, to remind me of everything they'd done for me growing up. I let them speak. When they finished, I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I understand that, I said, and this is still where I am. That was the moment they realized there would be no emotional escalation to work with, no anger to diffuse, no guilt to soothe, just a boundary held steadily. My mother asked if I was angry with them. I told her the truth. No, I'm just not available in the same way anymore. That distinction mattered. Anger can be argued with, availability cannot. The conversation ended shortly after that. Not abruptly, but conclusively. There was nothing left to clarify, no compromise to negotiate. The heat they might have expected never arrived, and without it, the confrontation lost its force. As I drove home, I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. For the first time, I had spoken from a place that didn't need validation. I hadn't tried to be understood. I had simply stated what was true for me. That's what made it effective. They didn't agree with me. I could see that. But agreement was no longer required for me to act in alignment with myself. And that, more than any argument, marked the end of the old pattern. Confrontation without heat doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't produce clean resolutions or emotional release. What it does produce is clarity, and clarity has a way of rearranging relationships, whether anyone is ready for it or not. I didn't walk away from that conversation with answers. I walked away with something quieter and more durable. I had named myself out loud. I'm not a different person now. That's the part people often misunderstand. I didn't become colder, harder, or less compassionate. I became more precise. The version of me that exists now quieter in a different way. Not silent out of habit or self protection, but intentional. I no longer rush to fill space or smooth over discomfort. I let pauses exist. I let other people carry their own uncertainty. That alone has changed how I move through the world. My relationship with my parents is calmer, not warmer, not closer in the way they once expected, but more honest. There's less assumption now, fewer unspoken expectations. When we talk, the conversations stay on the surface more often. Some people would call that distance. I call it accuracy. I still care about them. That never left. But caring no longer means overextending myself or preemptively solving what isn't mine to solve. I've learned that love doesn't require constant availability. Sometimes it requires restraint. What surprised me most was how this shift rippled outward. At work, I noticed how easily I used to absorb tasks that weren't mine simply because I could. I stopped doing that. Not abruptly, not defensively, just consistently. The world didn't fall apart. In fact, things became clearer, roles sharpened, respect followed. In friendships, I became more selective with my energy. I listened more closely to how people responded when I didn't immediately accommodate them. Some relationships deepened, others faded quietly. Both outcomes felt appropriate. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am in a crisis. I measure it by how aligned I feel when I say yes or no. There's a kind of confidence that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come from winning arguments or being right. It comes from knowing that you're acting from choice, not compulsion. That's the confidence I carry now. I also understand something I didn't before. People who benefit from your overextension often experience your boundaries as loss. That doesn't make the boundaries wrong. It makes them necessary. I don't regret paying off the debt. I regret that it took me so long to see what the debt represented. But regret, when examined carefully, can turn into insight rather than bitterness. If I could speak to the version of myself who believed being indispensable was the same as being loved, I wouldn't criticize her. I'd thank her for doing what she knew how to do. And then I'd tell her that she's allowed to take up space without earning it through sacrifice. That lesson didn't come easily, but it came cleanly, and it has stayed with me. I don't tell this story because it makes me look strong. I tell it because it makes something visible that often stays hidden. The quiet ways people are shaped by expectation, and the quiet ways they can step out of it without burning everything down. I am still calm, still reflective, still capable. I'm just no longer available for control disguised as need. There isn't a clean moral at the end of this story. No single sentence that wraps everything up and makes it comfortable. What there is, instead, is a truth I had to learn slowly, one that sits quietly beneath a lot of relationships, especially the ones we're told should never be questioned. Helping someone doesn't automatically make the relationship healthier. Sometimes, it just reveals what was already there. I used to believe that generosity was a kind of insurance, that if I showed up consistently, gave responsibly, stayed calm, everything else would sort itself out. What I learned is that generosity without boundaries doesn't buy safety. It buys access. And access, when left undefined, can turn into control without anyone ever naming it. When I paid off my parents' debts, I thought I was removing a burden, and financially, I was. But emotionally, I was removing something else, the leverage that had shaped our dynamic for years. What surprised me wasn't their relief, it was their reaction afterward. Being called ungrateful wasn't about money, it was about my refusal to return to the role that money had secured. What they wanted wasn't help, it was control. Not maliciously, not consciously, but control nonetheless. The comfort of knowing where I stood, what I would do, how much I would absorb. When that certainty disappeared, it felt like betrayal to them. To me, it felt like adulthood finally arriving on my own terms. There's a grief that comes with this kind of clarity. Not because you've lost people, but because you've lost illusions. The illusion that love always recognizes sacrifice. The illusion that being needed is the same as being valued. Letting go of those ideas doesn't harden you, but it does sober you. I don't tell this story to suggest that helping family is wrong. It isn't. I tell it to suggest that help should never require you to shrink, to disappear, or to give up your right to redefine yourself. If support costs you your autonomy, it isn't support anymore. Quiet dominance doesn't look like winning. It looks like choosing when to engage, when to step back, and when to end a chapter without asking for permission. It looks like holding your ground without raising your voice, like letting other people feel the absence of what they once took for granted. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this. You are allowed to change the rules, even if no one else agreed to them in advance. Especially then. I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever given something wholeheartedly? Time, money, emotional labor, only to realize later that what was expected of you mattered more than what it cost you. If you're comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Not to judge, not to fix, just to make visible the stories that are usually lived in silence.